Hello, it's Brooklyn Lou the Skeptic. Welcome in anyone who wants to chat. Appreciate Lone Atheist. How are you? Nice to see you. I'm hoping today to talk about morality. How do we determine morality? I believe it's determined by individuals, so we all kind of have our own sense of morality, and it can be different from person to person. But how do we come up with our morality? How do we determine it? Shut my phone off. Shutting down my phone, clear things up. There we go. Hey, Objective Ethics, how are you? I know you like to talk about morality. Hey, Dark God 6. Nice to see you too. Things okay. Made it through another day. All right. So morality. Who would like to talk about morality? What I really would like to hear is how people determine their own morality in their lives. What is the criteria they use to determine their own morality? Here's a link. There we go. All right, now, I guess I'll share how I determine my morality to see if anyone wants to talk about my morality. But I really do prefer to talk about how other people determine their morality. But my own personal morality, I determine very simply. I try not to overcomplicate it. I try to be real simple. Okay. And this is my simple way to determine if something is right or wrong. And what I do is I just simply ask myself a question. And that is whatever it is I'm considering doing for myself, or considering what other people do and just looking at it from an outsider perspective, I ask whether it helps human beings or it harms human beings. And that's about it. I mean, if I'm doing something I think is helpful to human beings, then I consider it a moral act. If it's something that harms human beings, I consider it immoral. Right? And I make that decision for myself. I don't go to other people. I actually make that decision for myself. So that's how I get my morality. Objective Ethics, I see you. Let me let you in. Hey, how are you?
Brother, it's always good to spend time with you, Lou. I'm glad. I appreciate you asking. How are you doing?
Okay. Just got through another day. It's the evening and made it through another one. Hopefully I'll have it tomorrow.
You can only hope. Yeah, no, this as you mentioned earlier, this topic is right up my alley. I'm actually preparing to do a formal debate. It's supposed to happen in the next 3 weeks. I'm debating a Christian the topic of the debate is whether or not the Bible can be used as a foundation to form a society, and this is based on morality. And I just recently had a debate about objective morality. So this is a topic I'm well versed in. I actually believe in objective morality, believe it or not, even though I'm an agnostic. I believe that we can look at this through evolution, and there's actually a scientific explanation for morality. Essentially, a scientific. It's really somewhat scientific because we're talking about evolution, but we can look at it philosophically as well.
Now, how do you determine? Because that's what I really was interested in, like personal views on how people determine their morality. Like what is it? What do you go to determine if something is right or wrong?
So that's a really good question, Lou. That's actually the question. And the problem is when you start talking about morality, quote unquote morality, what you're doing is you're attempting to combine two different elements here. You're combining ethics, which is essentially the rules. So I believe these rules are governed by nature, but Christians would say that God gave the rules, whatever, which obviously that's nonsense. But so you have ethics, which are basically just what the rules are. And then you have morality, which is how we apply the rules. So you're talking about applying something subjectively to an objective, applying an objective truth subjectively, if that makes any sense. It's a real tongue twister there. So subjectively, we all approach it just like you're saying. We make a determination for ourselves what kind of behavior that we're going to engage in. Mm-hmm. So that's our subjective approach. When we use the word subjective and objective, it also gets a little tricky because there's two different definitions. One of them is a scientific definition, and the other is a philosophical definition. So the scientific definition of objective means independent of any mind. So if you're thinking about something or deciding to do something, or if God is deciding to do something, that is always subjective because it's depending on a mind. Philosophically, the definition for objective means it's true in all cases, which means it never changes. And again, like when you look at the Bible, the laws of the Bible change over time, right? You got God gives the law to Moses. Then Jesus said, well, technically Jesus wants to uphold the law, but then Paul comes along and says, no, the law's been abolished. So you get this change in what the law is. So according to the Bible, cannot be objective by either definition. As far as ourselves go, when we start looking at meta versus normative, right? Meta ethics versus normative ethics, which is technically morality. We have an objective standard, which is the meta ethics, and then we have the subjective application, which is our morality. So you're right that we do apply, which is why secular humanism, even if you don't believe in objective morality, so to speak, which I think I can prove that it does exist through a good argument based on evolution, because the argument, as I laid it out in the past, is ultimately we're animals and we are a social animal. So we have to work together, which is a responsibility for every single individual to play a certain role so that the group can continue to survive. And in nature, everything must follow this unwritten rule because it's about balance. So we see from the top of the food chain all the way down to the plant kingdom, there is a balance, right? You can't overpopulate an area. You can't take too much prey from an area. You can't eat too many plants from an area. If you do too much of something or too little of something, you will not survive. And the planet ultimately, as far as life goes, from plants to animals, and I believe we're just another animal, we can't survive. And so this is what Aristotle was essentially talking about. He calls it virtue. And there's a thing in philosophy called virtue ethics. And essentially virtue is the state between deprivation and excess, which is that you need that balance. And this is what we see in nature, which is why I do believe that objective morals exist. If we just objectively say, if we didn't have rules about murder, right? So we're just going to let people murder whenever they want, our society would collapse. We know as secular humanists that we want to treat people like we want to be treated because that's going to be to the benefit of everybody. The best way for me to get people not to murder me is to not murder other people. It's not to murder them first, you know what I mean? Because we have a whole society. Now, if there's only 2 people on the planet, then that might be different. I can say, well, I'll murder them first and then I won't be murdered. But if there's only 2 people on the planet, I can't survive past my own lifetime without at least one partner. You know what I mean? So this is it gets really complicated, but at the end of the day, I don't think it's too hard to wrap your head around.
Well, here's one question I would ask you. Um, let's say there is objective morality. When someone is applying that to their lives, isn't it then subjective to them?
You're exactly right. And that's where you're combining normative ethics, or what we would call morality, to meta ethics, which is what we would call objective morality, essentially. So you're subjectively applying it to your life. But you could look at this in other ways as well, because you could say, well, something is good for me or bad for me based on physical health, like a diet or anything you want to look at in life, right? And you can apply that subjectively. Like I can say, I'm going to eat McDonald's every day for the rest of my life because subjectively, that's how I'm going to approach good health. Well, objectively speaking, I will not live a very long life if I do that, right? I mean, so you apply subjectively to something that's an objective truth.
Yeah, but I one of the things I don't I don't see, like, the thing with objective morality versus subjective morality as being all that much of a big deal in the life of regular people. In philosophy, yeah, I guess it's kind of a big issue. Uh, in religion, it could be a big issue, I guess. But just an average Joe going through life, aren't people just thinking of what they believe is right and wrong? I mean, are they really getting all into that? I don't think so. I think it's kind of like, I like to say it doesn't matter all that much.
Well, I would agree with you 100%. I don't think whether or not there is objective morality does matter. I think it's a fascinating topic, and it's something I've discussed with people and I do find interest in. However, at the end of the day, because we are subjectively applying these things to our lives, or we're subjectively choosing not to apply them to our lives, you're absolutely right. That's what matters the most, is what are we going to do with this morality situation? It's not whether or not there's an objective morality or not. That doesn't even matter. But the truth is, Lou, when you think about it, that could be applied to a lot of things, like religion, for example. Objectively speaking, there's no empirical evidence for the existence of any gods, despite what religious people say. That's something you pointed out really well in that last live that you did with that crazy guy, the Reverend Dr. Reverend or whatever, who was just talking himself in circles. You're like, hey, I just want something empirical, something objective that everybody could look at collectively, some kind of actual evidence. Well, there is no evidence. So what happens is people are subjectively applying their own interpretation of this religion and every other religion for that matter, and that's how they're dictating what is good for them and how they vote and how they treat people and so on and so forth. And that's what really matters. It
Yeah,
doesn't even
and
matter if God is real.
this is where I like to say it doesn't matter that much. Like, if you have uh, Islamic believers, as a group, you got all these different people believe in the same God. They believe in the Quran. All right. But some will think it's moral to fly planes into buildings. Some will say, no, that's immoral. So even within if I was in that particular religion, I say, I believe every word of the Quran. I believe every word of, what I've been told by the imam. I still, it still may not apply to whether or not I fly the plane into the building, because
You're
I'm
absolutely
still going to make my own decision.
You're
Right?
absolutely right. And that's why we all need to be held accountable for our actual choices and our actions. And there is no good reason that we can just say, well, God told me to do so, so therefore it's okay. That's not an excuse in a civilized society, which is why there are only, I think I looked it up, I did some research on this a while back, and there's basically worldwide on a global scale, there's only like 3 countries that actually operate on what's called a theocracy, which is where they base the rules on religion itself. Only one of those, it's Vatican City, bases their laws and rules on the Catholic creed and essentially the Bible. The problem you get, and why I'm going to win this debate I have coming up so handily, is because there is no codification of New Testament rules. If you look in the New Testament, there's nothing in there that tells you what the rules actually are. The Old Testament has the Mosaic Law, the 613 laws we know as the laws of Moses. So you have a codification of specific laws and how you're supposed to deal with things in a specific manner. And of course, they're horrible. They condone slavery. They condone, a female, an Israelite female, if she gets SA'd by an Israelite male, all he has to do is pay her father some silver, and then she has to marry him. The victim has to marry the perpetrator of an SA crime, which is completely insane. If our society functioned like that, it would completely collapse. That's just crazy.
Mm-hmm.
So when you go, Christians say, well, the New Testament, Jesus did away with all that. And again, not to get too far into that, but that's a contradiction with the exegesis of what Jesus actually said. Jesus specifically told the Pharisees that they were not doing the right thing because they refused to stone their children to death. Jesus followed the Mosaic Law. He believed that you should stone your disobedient children to death, if you know what I mean. So that's what Jesus taught. So to say that Jesus was doing away with the law is just what you get in Paul, which is a contradiction. And so there's nothing in the New Testament that codifies this is what you're supposed to do about this, this, or that. It's just a very generic, oh, you should be loving and patient and things of this nature. Well, what's loving to me is going to be completely different than what's loving to you or to somebody else. And what's patient for me is going to be different. You know what I mean? So there, without a codification, it's just what people are deciding at that point. It's completely subjective. That the very thing that they're saying isn't happening is exactly what's happening.
Yeah. I mean, we agree on that. I haven't come to a point where I'm positive either way if morality is objective or subjective. I am at a point where I think a lot of it is how we define the terms. And if the terms are defined a certain way, I could say, yeah, I see morality as being objective. Then when I hear a different take on or a different definition of the word, I could say a lot of times, I see that morality is subjective. Now, personal lean, because I literally mean that, I'm not sure, but my personal lean, it seems to me to be more subjective. All right. But I'm not going to, die on that hill because I really, it's not something that I think is that important. What's most important to me is what you are saying is that regardless if it's subjective, you still got subjective people interpreting it and carrying it out. So you still have bad things going on and good things going on, depending on the person. That's why, you could be in a religious community, say a fundamentalist Christian environment, and you're going to have good people and bad people in the same environment. And so I don't know that it matters too much, but I lean towards subjective, but that's only subjectively.
Well played, brother. Well played. I like that. No, Lou, like I said, you are absolutely right. The only thing that matters is what we do with the information. That's literally it. So gravity is an objective reality, right? Everybody knows that gravity is a thing. It doesn't technically exist per se. Well, it might. That's a whole nother. We're not going to get into physics, but we all know that gravity is real, right? It's true.
Yeah.
If I don't pay attention to that and I try to go through life just pretending that gravity isn't real, the first step that I take off a tall building is going to be the last step that I take. You know what I mean? It's how are we going to apply things subjectively to every situation? And just like you said, that is the only thing at the end of the day that matters. And that is why secular humanism is always going to lead to a more egalitarian society, a more civil society, a more productive society in every measure, because we can, as a group, look at the way things are going. We can look at history and we can we can compare those two things, and we can we can make accurate predictions about what we should do in the future. And that's what the scientific method tries to do. It tries to make predictions based off of evidence and how we determine data points. And so this all follows that same kind of thinking subjectively, which is why there's been a worldwide abolition of slavery. It's not just in Christian countries that slavery is illegal. It's literally, there isn't a single country in the world that I'm aware of that allows slavery.
Yes. And we agree, you and me, just when I'm not sure about this subjective. I lean towards subjective, but on secular humanist morality being based on reason and logic, to me, is a better way to look at morality. That's how I look at morality.
Well, when we come into reason and logic, it gets a little bit tricky because we are still using reason and logic, but reason and logic is how they justify things like slavery. It's how they justify things like religion. You just using reason and logic, you can make an argument for anything you want to, believe it or not. You have to get to actual evidence at some point, and you have to factor in data points. And reason and logic, you're right. I don't want to make it sound like you're not right, because you are. It's just that when it comes to certain words and definitions, that you can get into a slippery slope. I'll give you an example. There's that guy that we talked about, Mike, that real piece of trash from Cross Examinations, the Christian apologist.
Yeah.
He is right now running a campaign on his channel where he's using an AI program called Grok.
Yes,
And he's literally prompted Grok to discount the scientific method, discount scientific consensus, discount all these different things, so that when he asks Grok, he says only using reason and logic did the global flood happen. And of course, Grok says yes, because he's discounted all of the actual evidence. So you see what I'm saying? So that's, you could get into a real slippery slope. If you tried to ask a person back 2,000 years ago or longer, even in the antebellum South, when the African slave trade was happening, if you said, is this reasonable and logical, they would say yes. Slavery is perfectly reasonable and perfectly logical. And so that gets to be a real slippery slope there.
But isn't it coming from a specific theological position, though? I mean, yeah, I know people justified, all kinds of behavior like slavery, and they did it logically. I agree with that, but they had an assumption, all right, and the assumption was that the Bible is true, so they could see, oh, well, look, it says here you are allowed to take slaves from a foreign country, right? So
you're absolutely right. Yeah, you're absolutely right. But there's a trick there that gets tricky too, because, and I'm not a historian. I have looked into this, but maybe if there's a historian in the chat or somebody else that comes along this video, they may know more about this. Hello, Bear. They may know more about this than myself. But from what I've studied, you cannot go back in history to the written records, what we actually know for sure what was happening and how people's minds were thinking, right? So back to like Sumer and stuff like that. You cannot go back to that point to now and separate religion from society. Every single organized society has some ties to some kind of religious belief, even though we're not talking about a theocracy. There's no such thing as an atheist country. Atheism may be prevalent in more countries like the Netherlands or something like that, but it's still not considered atheist. You know what I'm saying? So to try and parse out, were people justifying slavery throughout history as religiously motivated or religiously justified, or is this simply something that governments were doing and they were controlling the masses through religion? You know what I mean? So it gets a little bit tricky how we're going to figure that out.
Yeah, and I tend to think the latter. All right, I tend to think not that it was the religious view, but that it was societal. But the books that were written by these people reflects the views that they had at the time.
See, I would say that I hate people who make the religious argument saying, oh, it was a thing, slavery was acceptable. And I say, well, what about the Book of Moses? Wasn't his whole point freeing the slaves? So shouldn't that be a bad thing, you know?
Well, the thing is, and thank you for coming in, Bear.
Well, thank you for having me.
All right. The thing is, when this chat, I wanted to focus on individual people like yourself, right? Like, what is it you do to determine your own morality? Can we start there, Bear?
Yeah, of course.
I'm curious to know, like, what is it that people do? I explain what I do.
Yeah.
and maybe like it, maybe don't like it, whatever.
Oh no, I was listening to you guys talk before, and you, especially with objective ethics, he made a lot of really good points as well. So, but with me and my morality, for me, it's subjective.
Yeah, but how do you, like, in real life, if something comes up in your life that you consider a moral issue and you're determining what is right and wrong, what do you do personally?
So, for example, let's say someone is stealing food. You could say, "Oh, that's a moral wrong." But if you add the context, he's stealing food to like feed a starving family. You could go, actually, yeah, it's a moral right.
Yeah, but
That's
I'm
such a,
saying,
such a great point, Bear. That's such an excellent analogy. I've used that one before because you could take, if there is, just because there may or may not be a meta ethic, let's say, a governing morality out there that says stealing is wrong all the time, it's always going to be immoral. But you can have two acts that you can compare side by side that both might be immoral, and we have to judge subjectively which one is more immoral. And your food analogy is a perfect one because you're right. We should, as a functioning society, we should not encourage laziness. We should not encourage theft. We should not encourage a lot of things that lead to homeless people stealing, for example. But the most important thing is that we should not be denying a hungry man food. That's the most important thing.
Yeah. Or you could use the other analogy of, let's say, you shouldn't murder. It's wrong. So you could say, well, what if it's a soldier defending, your country from an invading force? Is that wrong? And then you would go, well, actually, no, because they're protecting me.
yeah, but Bear, bottom line, it seems like you are determining that for yourself, right?
I am, yes, from my point of view. I know everyone will have a different view, but
Yeah, that was really one of the things I wanted to find out from people, if they feel they're determining their own morality. I do totally. I totally feel I am determining my moral decisions. I feel like I'm a free agent, so to say, and I'm determining if this is right or wrong. You seem to feel the same way, right?
I think we're all in agreement in that regard, even though I believe in objective morality. I think, like we said before, that we are going to apply these understandings subjectively in our own lives. And I don't think if you got even a religious person to come in here, anybody is going to say that they are objectively applying morality. They might argue for objective morality as being a thing. Like, I think it's based in nature and evolution and propagation of the species, etc. But a religious person will come in and say, well, God's opinion is objective. We're both going to have a different angle on that, but at the end of the day, we're both going to agree, just like the three of us are in agreement, that subjectively is how we're going to approach this situation as an individual, how we're going to apply it to our lives, etc. Because you can't, how can you possibly think that you can't think you're objective? I mean, I don't mean to be offensive when I say, I know I'm not objective, because the definition is dependent on a mind, or it's true in all cases, and neither one of those things can apply to a human. It's our mind independent, so to speak.
So I think we all agree on one thing in this little three-room discussion, three people discussion. I think we all agree that ultimately we are determining what we feel right and wrong is based on our own either objective or subjective principles that we adhere to. But we are subjectively applying this morality. I mean, we all agree on that.
yeah. Like, I'm religious, but I am definitely against objective morality, because when you do that, it you'll never have a middle ground. You'll never have everyone in agreement. It'll just lead to more problems than what it's set out to do.
So, Barrett, when you say you're religious, what religion are you? Or what do you?
Like Catholic.
Oh, okay. So it's unusual for me to hear Catholics or Christians or even Muslims express to me that they believe in a subjective type morality. So you're kind of different than a lot of people, right? I agree with you, but it seems like you're a little different than most. I mean, you don't go to the church to tell you what morality is?
No, I've got my own like formulation of
Yeah,
that.
you make your own choices and your own decisions.
Do you mind if I ask you a question, Bear?
Of course, mate.
Appreciate you very much. Thank you. Do you think, or do you feel, or believe, however you want to say that, that God's laws or God's will is objective or subjective?
I would say at the time it was set out to be objective, but over time it's become subjective.
Oh, interesting. Okay, that is interesting. That's so when it was, and I agree with you that it's subjective currently for sure, but just out of curiosity, if you can help me understand, how was it ever at any time objective?
So when it was a case of when Christianity was in its roots, it had those objective laws that it followed, and then when it became adopted by the Roman Empire, they made like subjective changes to fit in with their civilization. And obviously, as Christianity has expanded through the ages, there's been these changes throughout all the centuries to fit into this society that it's a part of, to the point where we're at now.
No, that makes a lot of sense to me. I guess what I'm still having a disconnect for is before all the changes came, before man was ever involved in this, what makes the source itself objective?
It was because they were just taking the information straight from with the Aramaic Bible, was it? Like they were just getting it straight from the source and believing in that as like the be all end all.
So is the Bible the source, or is God the source ultimately? Because God dictated the Bible through the Holy Spirit according to the theology, right?
Yeah, so God is the source, but I think we as humans have just I wouldn't say we've infracted upon God's law. We've just grew up with the law and changed it to be a betterment.
So how then is God an objective source?
I'd probably have to say through. I forget I forget the name of it. Sorry.
Can I ask you a question? So, are you familiar with the Bible verses? I could pull them up if you want me to. I don't have it right in front of me, but if you need me to, I could pull them up. But there's multiple Bible verses that talk about God having a mind. Does Catholic theology say that God has a mind?
Yeah, it does depend on the sect, but yeah, they do have that teaching.
So, if the definition of subjective is dependent on a mind, and God has a mind, how is God objective?
Do you know what? I couldn't actually say. Tell the truth, I'll grant you that I couldn't actually say.
No, I really respect your honesty, and I appreciate that you're not getting offended because I'm not meaning to be critical. I'm just trying to figure this all out. And I appreciate your honesty, brother.
Yeah, no, of course. It's like I do understand when it comes to talking to other Christians, it can be a handful.
Well, Brooklyn Lou has created a platform that 99% of the time is extremely civil, and he does a great job of opening up the doors for people who have differences of opinions. So I'm really glad that you jumped in here.
Yeah, because I've been on a stream before when he was asking me about you were asking me, Lou, about like why are you religious, and I said that it's like a personal thing, but I was also raised with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm happy you find it, a place you can come on and talk. That makes me feel really good because
but as I said, I wouldn't force my religion down your throat, and I wouldn't say you're wrong because you're not religious. That's your choice. I'm not going to infringe upon it.
Yeah, you're a real gentleman, and I appreciate that always.
Do you mind if I ask one more question? I don't want to be rude to Scott, who jumped in here.
No, of course. Go on.
I just on this thread. So, do you think, or does the Catholic Church teach that God's rules apply to God as well, or is he not accountable to his own rules?
There are instances where God will lay a rule that he has to follow himself, because I think there's two notable stories with him and Lucifer where Lucifer tests his rule against him and says, will you follow it? So there are examples, but off the top of my head, I would say there are examples, yes, but there may be examples where it might contradict him.
Fair enough. Scott, thank you for your patience, and Bear, thank you for your honesty. Do you mind if I hang out for a few more minutes, Lou?
Yeah, you can hang out. I wanted to bring Scott in. And,
Yeah. Can you hear me
Scott, you
okay,
there?
though? Yeah. Am I coming through loud and clear?
Yep.
Okay, awesome. Hey, I was just hanging back here, just listening to the conversation, and I'm enjoying it. And as far as anything else I could add, I'm not really sure. I guess on naturalism, if morality is generally seen as, if you're I guess believing or appealing to objective morality, I just want to ask, on naturalism, are we looking at the consequences of actions and the well-being of sentient creatures as the grounding of the morality, or is it something like it's just kind of derived from the existence of pleasure and pain, and so these judgments that we make are kind of based in that, in the experience of what we do and don't like? Is that the objective standard we're looking at?
Yeah, that it can be weighted either way. I would agree with the former as opposed to the latter. So it is ultimately going to be based on an evolutionary standpoint of what ultimately is going to benefit. And you can't guarantee anything because a big asteroid could crash into the planet and wipe it all out, and it's all for naught. But assuming that we have an active role to play in our own destiny, then I do believe objective morality can be based, the meta ethics can be based in that specifically.
Okay. So I would say, like, well, maybe what you're saying is like, we've got all these different minds in the universe, like mine, yours, Lou's, everybody that exists and is considered conscious, has a point of view. It's local, and you're saying that this, one of the hallmarks, I guess, to a naturalistic, objective morality or ethic could be the fact that just as specific species, um, it kind of sort of entailed in them that they'd rather go towards pleasure than pain. We'd rather our goals revolve around those natural drives and things of that nature. Is that kind of what you're saying there with that? And that's outside of mind. So in other words, those sort of qualities come from nature somehow, like maybe through genes or whatever.
So there's when I do agree with you, I think on principle, that where I'm a little bit hesitant to just buy full into what you're saying is because when you talk about the differences between pleasure and pain, that
Hmm.
gets really sticky because I'm a former drug addict. So I can tell you that there's some things that feel really, really good that are not good for you. And if we engage in
Right.
too much of that pleasure, we end up in a very problematic situation.
Very good point. Very good point. Because you could examine the long-term effects versus the short-term maybe payoffs. That the brain may say, "Oh, this heroin feels really good for now," but then your future self is going to pay for it down the line, and so it sort of like depends on what you prioritize with yourself. Is it the present self or is it the future self that I'm trying to benefit? What am I trying to plan for my life to go on and prosper, or am I just going to live in the moment and do these drugs and who cares what happens?
Exactly. And I think that same approach can be taken not just to something like our own drug use, for example, which is a really easy example to look at, but we could even map that out onto the treatment of others and say it might feel really good to SA somebody. It's going to feel good to me anyway, let's say, for example, or I might get, whatever. But if we have a society that allows that to go unchecked, that society will collapse because it
Uh-huh.
leads to so many other problems that are tied into it.
Yeah, we would have it where we would have that as a society where that just becomes the norm, and then as that progresses, people start losing the pleasure of that, so they'll turn to more extreme things to the point where you'll have a society where people are torturing each other just to get a sensation.
You're exactly right. And this brings up an objection I have to heaven. So I like to go to, even though I'm an agnostic, I really enjoy going to a men's group that's held at a church a couple nights a month, because fellowship with men, or for women to just fellowship with women, I think is really important for personal growth and community and everything else, because of the dynamics that happen socially when you introduce people of the opposite sex. There's a real interesting, psychology behind that whole thing. But the point of it is I go hang out with, I'm able to interact with hundreds of Christians in this process. And when I start talking about heaven versus heaven and hell and things like that, it is fascinating to me that every single person I've talked to, coming from the same church with the same epistemology, has a completely unique idea of what's going to happen in heaven. And I don't want to derail the conversation from morality, but it is interesting, because one of the issues or not issues, but one of the questions I have about heaven is this eternal bliss. Because when we look at society and the real life, drugs is a great example. You could do drugs and it feels great, and all you want to do is just party on the weekends because it's a release from work, and then pretty soon you're doing it every day, and then pretty soon you're doing it all day every day, and it becomes to where the pleasure, you can't keep up with the pleasure because the pleasure fades over time, and you end up getting to a point in your life where it's no longer pleasurable. You're just doing it because your body is
It's
addicted
used
to
to it.
it.
Hmm.
It needs it. It literally thinks it needs it. It's a chemical thing. That's why addiction is so hard to overcome for people. So heaven to me seems like it would run into that same problem. And I haven't, it just, again, I don't want to derail from morality, but when you talk about this, what we've kind of touched on here, the overcoming something that you could have too much of a good thing is a common way of saying it,
Mhm.
Mm.
Yeah,
Totally agree with that, by the way.
absolutely. Um,
That's why many drug addicts are seeking that thrill of the first high, right? A lot of drug addicts, they go back and they say, I felt so good the first time I did this. And a lot of them keep chasing that, and it never is as good as people tell me. Sometimes they feel it's never as good as the first time, you know.
mhm.
Well, there's been lots of studies about that. Even Madonna wrote a song about that called "Like a Virgin." There's never going to be that same sensation you get in anything in life. She was talking about intercourse, obviously, you know what I mean. But when you lose your virginity or you do something new for the first time, once you've done it for the first time, you'll never ever be able to fully replicate that sensation.
Right.
Right, right.
Yeah.
And some of the things that happen to us, whether it's new things that we experience for the first time, or whether they're really dire sort of circumstances we find ourselves in, it's all sort of part of the evolution of the human. It's kind of like we grow from the suffering, we grow from the things that happen. So sometimes morality comes into play because we want, just out of a moral, point, we want to say, well, we want to avoid this or that out of a moral reason, but it could be a short-sighted reason. So it seems like the goals are sort of subjective. Like, what are we making these ethics for? Is it to benefit us now or in the future? A society, for example, can discuss these things and iron it out and carve out laws based on those moral prerogatives, right? But those are goals, and then we can talk about objective ways to reach those goals, right? Is that the kind of objective ethic we're talking about, or are you saying that it's more fundamental, sort of like even the goals are subjective?
I think it's more fundamental, because I think the goals, again, we're talking about being mind dependent. Even
Uh-huh.
if we have every mind on the planet, as you mentioned before, or every mind that's ever in the universe, wherever that is, it's always going to be dependent on a mind as to how we apply our decisions and our actions and our thoughts and so on and so forth, how we determine things. That's always dependent on the mind. But that doesn't mean that something cannot exist external of our minds, but how we interact with it is going to be subjective, how we apply that. So you're really combining, it's a tall hill to climb philosophically, because I am attempting to explain how to combine a objective how to subjectively apply actions to an objective standard.
Hmm. Well, they I don't know. This is sort of said analogously, but I guess it kind of applies here. Is that there's what you're describing is a kind of communication between the human mind and nature.
That's beautiful. That is really well said, Scott.
Yeah, that's exactly kind of what's going on because when we interact with nature, that's what happens. It can be seen in like any form of communication. Humans engage in behaviors that involve interpreting signals from nature. We observe animal behavior that does the same, analyzing environmental data. It's really a form of communication, I think. And myself, I'm an idealist, so I tend to look at the answer to that question is morality subjective or objective? Ultimately, I don't know, but it seems to be a little bit of both in a way.
Well, I just loved how you said that, because this is something else, and might be where I lose a lot of people, but there's a thing that's called human exceptionalism. The idea is that humans are the only ones that have any morality, any moral responsibility, so on and so forth, and that there's all these other traits that they say only can apply to a human, and there's social traits, not just biological or physiological traits. And I happen to be in the camp that I disagree with that. And so, I'm not going to say that I'm a Zionist or something like that, where I'm going to sweep the sidewalk just so I can walk on it and don't step on a bug or something. But I will carry the spiders outside instead of squashing them. And you know what I mean? So I try to live my life to the best I can to that. But at the end of the day, I don't want to sound like a hypocrite or something like that. But I do not believe in human exceptionalism. I believe that nature is essentially almost like the Gaia theory. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Gaia theory,
Yep,
where
I
the
sure
whole
am.
universe is
Yep,
basically one living organism. And I'm
correct.
not saying I buy into that per se, but I do think there's a lot to be said for that. Panpsychism would be another
Hmm.
really interesting way of looking into it. So I'm not trying to promote those ideas in a sense that I think they're true, but I do think that there's a lot to be gleaned from them in that regard.
Right. The one thing I think most people agree with is that one of the most important, the only real way you can derive any kind of meaning, any kind of purpose in life, anything like that, is through being a conscious creature. It's our consciousness. That's the interface we have to reality. And, whether you believe that this consciousness reflects reality as it truly is, which I don't think it does, I think we have like a species specific interface. And so we see colors, we hear sounds the way we do, we taste things the way we do, we think about things the way we do. We have this communication. So the universe appears to us, it comes to us a certain kind of way. We don't actually see or have direct access, like you said. We don't have that direct access, but our mind is limited, and it seems like everything we experience is for us as a subject within this greater, phenomenon, this greater reality. And so it kind of helps me see that morality, whether it's subjective or not, is very meaningful. It's very important. It reflects on your experience that you're going to have in life, you know. Um, but at the same time, we are learning from nature. Nature kind of speaks to us in so many ways. And so, like you said, we derive our morality and ethics from nature, in
Hmm.
so many different kind of ways. And so, in that respect, you could say that it's sort of an objective facts that exist out there that we learn. It's almost like minds modulating minds. So, that makes perfect sense on idealism because truths are within somebody's mind or something's mind, a phenomenal sort, maybe not a god or something like that, but some sort of substrate that can maybe like some sort of platonic forms.
I knew
um
that's exactly what I was thinking of. I was thinking to myself when you said that, the perfect forms, Plato's perfect form
yep.
theory. And it really does. Plato's perfect form theory, in fact, Neoplatonism, I would say,
Yep.
is a really interesting counter to theology. But I didn't mean to interrupt you, but you literally were, it's like you were reading my mind there for a second, brother. But another interesting thing that you mentioned that I thought about though is, and again, this is based off of historians' interpretation of a limited data points. So it may not be fully accurate, but to the best of my understanding is when we go back beyond the written record and we start looking into paleontology and things of this nature,
Mhm.
what we see is, and what we think we're seeing anyway, is that our earliest hominids actually did what has evolved into the gods that we've created in more modern societies were just ways of humans trying to understand and relate to nature.
Mhm.
So this
Mhm.
really does tie into this observation that there's a natural phenomenon that's beyond what we can really understand at any given time in history that you want to
Mhm.
look at, and we apply what's become known colloquially. God, I hope I said that right, as the God of the gaps fallacy. So
Mhm.
we
Mhm.
apply agency to everything. That's a part of our brains, how it works. We want to apply agency to everything with the
Yep.
hyperactive agency detection device. It's the HADD located in the brain. We have this
Yep.
inherent need biologically or physiologically to do this. And so when we can't understand something like why is the thunder crashing or why is the lightning, flashing or things, or why is it raining on my crops and now it's not raining on my crops? And we apply gods essentially, quote unquote, to explain this until science gives us ultimately a better explanation.
That's why in the past humans of all different cultures have deified and worshipped natural phenomena like death.
Mhm.
The Egyptians had a god of death, Greeks had a god of
Mhm.
death, Romans, because that is what humans do. They
Fascinating.
humanize something to make it more to them.
Man, that is fascinating, man. That's really
It's called
fascinating.
it's called when we anthropomorphize things, which is why the
Yeah.
gods we invent are all anthropomorphized. They have human traits because that's all we really know as
Yep.
human beings, which is why I don't believe in any gods that exist outside it, because they're no different. The descriptions ultimately are given by humans, and they all have these human traits and human characteristics, and they go through human struggles. And so I don't see any evidence that there's something outside of humans in this
Correct.
formation.
Mhm.
What hard fast rule, no god or deity ever whispered in my ear that these apes on this planet are supposed to have it all figured out, that we're supposed to know the truth of everything, ontology and all of that. There's no god whispered that in my ear. In fact, the only thing in my experience is that I'm constantly learning something new and I'm constantly wrong about so many things. So, like the limited mind, the number one job it has, I always love to say this, the number one job for our brains is to actually deceive itself. Like we evolved for fitness payoffs, not necessarily to do quantum mechanics and do math and figure out the fundamentals of the universe. But we do have this ability to transcend it. That's the great thing. We're able to transcend through reason, logic, and those sort of things come together with our conscious experience. And so, it's I think it's good to be humble. It's very good to be humble.
Mm.
Hey,
That's like
Scott.
Yep.
Scott, I just wanted to ask you my opening question when I started this is a personal one. All right. And it's what do you personally, how do you determine morality for yourself?
Yeah. I look at what's going to well, there's two ways to look at it. But generally, I guess when I think about morality, I think about policing myself from doing bad behavior, right? And good behavior. So I would say, well, what a good thing would be to do is to increase somebody's experience, in a positive way. So for me, that's how I determine to do it. If it is, you know, committing a crime, maybe robbing somebody, stealing from somebody, um, is that really going to increase their happiness or joy in their experience? No. So I would say that if I wanted to intentionally do that, then I would define that as doing an immoral thing.
Mhm.
because it goes against that goal of mine, which is to increase someone's conscious experience in a positive way.
And you determine that for yourself. Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay. I
And that
think
probably
everyone
comes
in
from the way
this
you're
chat room
raised, and
agrees on that.
yeah.
You know.
It's for me, it's the immediate thing. Now I think what objective ethics is going to say is that while we're conscious of our immediate meeting our immediate goals, we may not be conscious about the reason we decided those roles. See, I'm kind of like objective ethics in a way, like on idealism, I see nature as working through me, right? And I may not always be conscious of why I do things. Like, for example, I like to create music and podcasts and things like that too. But somebody could tell me, like my family member, or somebody could say, "But Scott, you're not really making a lot of money doing that. So why are you doing it? I mean, it's
I
taking your
hear you.
time. What?" And it's like it has nothing to do with that. And you make a good point, but it has nothing to do with that. It's just nature is just driving me to have this feeling, this craving, like, oh, it's time to do a podcast. It's time to write a song or a track. I may not be very good at it, but that's not the reason nature selected me to do it. It just does what it does. And I'm just along for the ride. So that kind of talks about morality too. You know, my goal setting. There's probably a reason why I have goals the way I do. It could be just nature wants to express itself through Scott Williamson and the way his brain is wired up and the way his body's wired up, and this is the way he expresses morality and how he experiences the universe, you know?
Yeah. I mean, you and I always think similar. I
Mhm.
mean, I don't go as far as you do.
Yep.
Like I guess with this nature thing,
Yep.
because I don't go as deep as you do, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
But I mean, I do things now in my life based on not based on money all the time, right? I
Yeah.
mean, money to me is just it's something I need to live my life, but I'm not driven by money anymore. You know,
Yeah. Yeah.
it's more like I want to express myself. That's kind of my driving force now.
Well, you know, you're going to be happier doing being consistent with nature. And I know you may not believe all of this, but I would say, in my opinion, if you went to a job where you were maybe making six figures, making a lot of money, everything you ever wanted, I would really want that for you, Lou. Even if you say you wanted it, I'd say I would want you to do what you want and make all that money just to find out, just so you would finally learn that that's not where you're going to be happy at if that's not what you really are passionate about. If you're passionate about doing these podcasts or doing some of the things that you do right now, which is obviously the case, then that's where you're going to be the most happiest when you follow yourself. You know, let nature flow through you. Let it direct you to where, and you don't have to then worry about it. You don't have to worry about peer pressure, what people think about you, you know, societal rules and narratives that they feed us daily.
Mhm.
That stuff doesn't contribute to our happiness. Our happiness is when we're in alignment with nature itself, you know.
And you're not fighting yourself.
Yep, that's right.
That's the way I see that because I
Yep.
you know I'm getting up in age and I remember times when I was fighting with myself or my own thoughts, you know.
Uh-huh.
So to have peace of mind, you can't really fight with yourself.
Right.
I
Well, it's
mean,
always a losing battle. Just know that.
yeah,
That you know, it's
yeah.
like people. My ex-wife, she had suffered with chronic depression for years and years and years and years, and was on all this medication. And she used to really, her approach was to try to will herself not to be depressed, and that was contributing to the depression, to the level of anxiety was triggered by her wanting to control her depression. And it's like you can't control it. You're just going to have to let it run its course. when it's there.
Sorry to jump in there. I'm just going to jump off the stream now, Chief, but
Sure.
just want to say thank you for having me. It's been great speaking with you all.
Oh, thanks, Bear.
Thanks, man. Thanks,
Always
Bear.
appreciate you coming by.
Oh, thank you again, Chief.
It was so nice to meet you, Bear. I'd really like to follow up with you sometime. If you give those questions a little bit of thought, I'd just really be curious as to what you come up with.
Oh, definitely, Chief. Hopefully see you again on this channel.
Thanks
Oh,
for
take
stopping
care,
by.
guys.
All right, Bear.
So I'm gonna ask you, Scott, because I want to see if, because we seem to be on similar journeys in a way, and yet I don't think we agree on everything. But
No,
nobody ever agrees on everything.
no, you're not supposed to.
Right? But would you say that peace of mind is a really big priority? Because it is for
Yes.
me. That's a
Yes.
really big priority.
Yes, it is. It's for me, from just my observation and anything I've read, researched, people do drugs, people become alcoholics, people get addicted to porn, people cheat on their spouses, people engage in a lot of harmful behavior as an escapism, but what are they looking for? They're just looking for peace.
Yeah.
They're looking for that place that's going to finally let them rest.
Yes.
And that's where they want to go. But what most people don't realize is that when you don't recognize, when you fail to recognize that that peace is not found out there, it's not found in your chasing, it's not found in following someone else's experience or following someone else's story or commandments or prerogatives. Those are the things that you're going to have a rude awakening. You're never going to find it. You're going to spend your whole life chasing down those roads, those rabbit holes. And the real peace is right under your nose. And it's
Yeah.
so close to each and every one of us that we don't see it. But
I
it's right
I
there.
see exactly the things you see in that regard. Right. Um, I see religion as being a barrier, at least for a lot of people, that it's keeping them from truly having peace of mind. Now I
Right.
can't prove that, right? I can't literally prove such a thing, but it is something that I feel is true. I think religion is a barrier for many people.
Yeah. It's an external object. So we're talking about an inner satisfaction, peacefulness. It's kind of ineffable if you think about the extent to which one could find peacefulness in their existence. If you've ever meditated or you've got into a really good brain state, good mind state, you can really experience no time, no worry, nothing's important. You're just where you're supposed to be and everything's perfect and warm. You can get in that space. It's possible for everyone. And once you do that, especially if you do that enough, you have that experience enough, you start realizing just how silly and absurd, life can be. Everything we chase, everything we want and do, it all from a higher perspective is just absurd. It's not that serious. It's
Yeah.
actually funny. It's actually something that once you have that realization, it becomes sort of like a cosmic joke. And when you get to that point in life, when you finally get to that realization, oh man, you can't go back. You can never go back, ever. You'll never go back to a religion. You'll never go back to a drug habit. You'll never go back to those things because you've reached the simple, organic, natural state of peace in your life. And there's nothing better than that. And so that's what I would encourage people to do is just look within, look at yourself, check in with yourself. You know, are you comfortable where you're working? Are you comfortable the way that you interact with the world? Are you chasing too much? Are you anxious? Are you stressed? Are there red flags? Like, do you have addictions? Examine all that stuff and try to work through it. but it's not going to come from more of the same. You know?
Yeah. I mean, that's a journey towards peace of mind. I mean, that's how I look at it.
Yeah.
We all want peace of mind, I think.
Yep.
But we all have a journey of how we might get there, and unfortunately a lot of people never get there.
Right.
They'll die in a state of being miserable,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's
Mm-hmm.
sad to me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
you know
Yeah. That's the cruelty. That's the coldness of nature. Is that even nature works through psychopaths. Unfortunately, they're called to just do mayhem in the world. Unfortunately, they do that. Unless they can be treated. But a lot of people go untreated. And it's very sad because I don't think anybody chooses to have that anxious, stressful, depressed life. You know, those people that you see that are so unhappy and that act out their anger and their depression and sadness on other people, um, part of the problem is they don't recognize it within themselves. They're not really conscious of it, fully conscious of it. And so
and
they
they
just,
I would say they don't even know themselves really.
right, right.
They're not. They don't really know themselves. They're fighting within themselves. There's all kinds of stress, in their mind.
Yeah.
It's confusing them, you know.
You know, Western society, unfortunately, there's a trade off. And one of the trade offs is our mental um, and psychological well being. Um, that's what we've kind of traded off because looking at statistics, um, well to do, wealthy people, all the way up the scale, all the way up our societal hierarchy, um, there's a huge percentage of those folks, just in numbers, just in the numbers, that they're in need of some, you know, um, antidepressants, anxiety medication. They're on these pills to soothe their psychology because their mind is killing them. They're depressed. They're chronically depressed. And they have all the money in the world, but they're out here chasing it, and they're out here. They're so busy, focused on that, but yet they're suffering inside somehow. For some reason, they're empty inside, and it's causing a depression. That's what the numbers show, as opposed to people in like some, you could say, third world countries, for example, people that live off the land, like farmers, people that till the land, farm the land all day, work hard. Those people have a very low need of any sort of psychological, psychiatric medication. You know, they do a lot better because they're in touch with the world. I think a lot more intimately than a lot of your successful people out here in the West because they're so focused on this artificial life that we've created, and that's the trade off. I'm not saying that we don't need it because, I mean, let's face it, we're all kind of addicted to our medicine and our convenience and our technology, and we need it. It's fine, but it's a trade off. And I've noticed that. And hopefully, maybe we'll evolve to a point where we can maybe learn something about ourselves that can move us into a better world where we can have both. We can have our
Well,
cake and eat it too.
I think you've really touched on the key here because just let me jump in here real quick, gentlemen. I don't mean to
Yep.
be rude, but you've touched on so many good topics, and I don't want to lose track of it all. And I'm going to go back as far as when you talked about what reminded me of Aristotle. The more we know, the more we realize we don't know anything, kind of a thing.
Hmm.
That was
Hmm.
quite a while ago. Then you also touched on nature, and Lou was talking about how he doesn't quite, even though you guys agree, he doesn't quite tie it to nature as much as a more practical utilitarian utility that he applies to his own life
Hmm.
based on various aspects, which he didn't specify, but he kind of rejected the nature concept. I am in a complete agreement with you about the nature concept, and that caused me to think of like not only a Neoplatonism and what they call the philosophy of numbers, but you think about guys like Pythagoras and
Yeah.
how he talked about numbers and things, and you mentioned music, and there's a real metaphysical connection. Music is a mathematical form, philosophically speaking. So there's a real connection there that affects us all. I know Lou's a big fan of music. He's mentioned before it was a huge part of his life, and so even though he may not think that he may articulate that he's not necessarily in touch with this whole nature thing, the very idea that he's in touch with music and that music has this emotional and impactful effect on his life tells me that there is really a natural element to how he's interacting with the world. But the thing that you guys were talking about, I kind of wanted to push back on a little bit about this peace of mind concept and the way it's being articulated. Very much like the way that I was talking to Lou about using logic and reason exclusively to determine things. It's not to say that we don't use logic and reason to determine what is true, objectively speaking, but it cannot be the only thing that we use because it's a slippery slope. And when it comes to
Mm,
peace of mind, people can have peace of mind and be involved in terrible, terrible things because the human mind is such a powerful tool that can be worked against us. Our own minds can work against us, that we can convince ourselves of talking animals and sky daddies that tell us, you know what I mean, give us rules to
mm,
live by and stuff. So if we really take it to the extreme, that in and of itself is a slippery slope. It's not to say that peace of mind isn't important, but it's how do we attain peace of mind in a way that's truly objectively beneficial to the group? Because again, ultimately, as an animal species, we have to prioritize our individual responsibilities within the group. That we have to be a part of the benefit to the whole, which is where I believe
mm,
objective morality comes into. And I think for me personally, even though I don't disagree with any of the specifics that either one of you gentlemen raised, because I think each one of your points was perfectly valid, the one thing that I think we're missing, if I can humbly suggest, is that true peace of mind and the natural peace of mind comes from balance. It's what I was talking about
yes.
with the Aristotelian virtue, that
Mm,
perfect state between excess and deprivation. That's what brings us peace of mind. A
yes,
peace of
yes.
mind that can last and that's
Very,
tangible,
very
that's
good.
measurable.
That's awesome, man. And thank you for that course correction because you're exactly right. And I usually talk about this all the time that it's all about a balance, because we have to sort of use our intuition sometimes, even though we can't, because and even if you could attain peace at all times, how would that be really realistic and sustainable? Because and it would lose its value. Like I even say that about the ego. Like everybody talks bad about the ego. Like we should really just get rid of our ego. Our ego is evil, blah 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 blah. But without the ego, I wouldn't know where to put, where what mouth to put the fork, right? I have to there has to be a practical, understanding. It's not all about dissolving the ego. It's also about accepting your ego and valuing your ego. There's a balance. So I think it applies the same what you just pointed out. So that was a really good point.
I don't think in psychology, I don't think the ego is necessarily bad. So I think you're correct on that.
Hmm.
We have to apply a certain value system. And if we don't apply that value system to ourselves, first and foremost, we have nothing that we could consider to be quote unquote tangible that we can apply to anybody else for a value system.
Hmm.
But the ego, I mean, who Freud is the one who really got into the ego. Am I correct
Yeah.
on that?
Yeah.
And yeah, Freud and Karen Horney both actually. There's a lot of
Oh
philosophers
yeah.
or psychologists and stuff, but Freud is a perfect example.
But he didn't determine the ego was bad, right? Like
No.
there can be negative aspects to how we see the ego, or the ego can. I look at the ego personally as neutral, kind of. It can be good, can be bad.
Well, it's interesting when you bring up Freud because I had done a talk on Tristan Gabriel's channel about the origins of atheism and agnosticism. And one of the interesting things that I brought up is Freud himself, because Freud and the ego, his thoughts about how useful the ego can be, but also how easily manipulated the ego can be, and how this has been control,
Well,
used by governments and stuff like that, is Freud taught that religion, very much like what Karl Marx taught, that religion is the most effective way to get people to cooperate, especially to do something terrible or even to do something good, because the religion, when we align ourselves with what's called groupthink, it feeds our ego tremendously. You know what I mean? That feeling like we are aligned with what the group is aligned with gives us this affirmation, this feeling of belonging, and so many other things that tie into the ego. So religion is a tool that provides a perfect format, a perfect place to feed into that ego. And that's why I've often said, and I don't mean to say this to be mean, because I certainly don't, but it's just when I observe religious people and they talk about how religious people are more loving and more giving and more whatever humanistic and egalitarian and stuff, I actually disagree based off of a lot of things, frankly. But as far as I'm concerned, religiosity is one of the most narcissistic things that could possibly be, because you are
Hmm.
really, because there is no objective there is no God single entity up there that everybody could see, that's empirically evident. It all comes from within, and because we know that for a fact, it is coming from within. It's all subjective and it's all based on your own individual interpretations, kind of like I was talking about heaven.
Hmm.
Everybody, even people within the same denomination that have the same epistemology, have a completely different way of ultimately approaching life and justifying their actions and coming up, developing their thought processes, because we're all individual human beings. And therefore, if you're going to take something that ultimately comes from within yourself and you are going to impose that onto society, that is the very definition of narcissism. Everything is about you at that point.
Yeah.
I agree too. I agree with that.
You know, the ego is kind of seen as like an essential aspect of the self, right? It serves to
Yes.
maintain like a center. It gives you a center and way to adapt to your external circumstances. So it's kind of like a safe space. You create this, this being, this we call the self. And one of the thing I'm a big, or yeah, I might as well say it. Yeah, psychonaut. You know, I've experimented I've experimented with substances in the past, like DMT, stuff like that. I've came into just naturally meditative states to have similar kind of states where the self dissolves. This ego death happens, right? And so what you immediately realize when you do something like that is you realize it's very possible to exist in a state with no ego. And this is a very just such an alien kind of existence. And this is what those things do to you. They just kind of get you in touch with that way of being, you know. And because we take for granted our ego, we just take it for granted. You're looking through your eyes, you're going through your day, getting in your car, doing your things through your eyes, and you're hearing things, you're doing it's all processing through the self, and yourself as opposed to your neighbor and this person and that person. And there's separation. It's all this duality. We see
Well,
all this duality.
I think what we should do, frankly, is we should view our egos in the same way that we view something like our pain receptors. The pain receptors serve a very important purpose. Without pain receptors, I wouldn't know that I was on fire. I wouldn't know that I was bleeding to death, so on and so forth. The
Hmm.
ego plays a similar role in its imperative. Without the ego and without having balance and a really good understanding of what the ego is sending signals to my brain and telling me, right, then I can be out of touch with what is best for myself, what's best for nature, what's best for the environment that I'm in. And it gives us a transcendental connection to the environment as opposed to a physical connection like the pain
Yes,
receptors do.
yes, exactly. That makes a lot of sense because that's the point that I was about really to make. That you hit it right on the head. There has to be a balance because this duality, of course, we deal with it every day and we have to. Otherwise, we'd be bumping into objects all day. We've got to deal with the experience, the way it comes to us, the appearance of this world is very real. It's very consequential. I think, Lou, you were with me when we were debating that precept Christian, and we sort of got into that. You know, you can't know you exist
Oh
without
God.
God, and and that was just ridiculous. I'm like, no, all you need is your experience of existing. That's the root of it. And he just couldn't. He thought that was circular.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, I
because he
remember that.
refused. I know all the precepts. I didn't know that conversation. But I can guarantee you, I know exactly how it went because he's engaging in his own precept without
Hmm.
realizing it. He's pointing his finger, not realizing that there's 3 or 4 other fingers pointing back at himself, depending on how he makes
Yeah.
his hand. You know what I mean? Like he's literally the whole precept thing is so circular and nonsensical. But you cannot. The problem is when the preceptors engage in philosophical debates. First of all, it's a desperation tactic. If you have to use philosophy to try and
Hmm.
argue something into existence, that is a logical fallacy known as the definitional fallacy. You cannot define something into
Yes.
existence. It either exists or it doesn't. You can't talk it into existence, no matter how logical. And that's why I was kind of points to what I was talking about before. You can use a valid argument, right? But it doesn't mean you come to a sound conclusion. There's a huge
Hmm.
difference there. Just because your argument doesn't contain any logical contradictions and it can be formed in a valid manner doesn't mean you've ascertained any truth to that whatsoever. And that's exactly what precept is. It's a way to formulate a valid argument so people who don't understand philosophy don't understand the true how they have an equal authority to hand wave away any presuppositions that are unverified. You could just you don't have to engage it whatsoever. You can say nope. You don't need this for the grounding of reality. Prove it. You can't just argue it. You have to prove to me that that's the grounding for intelligence. And you guys mentioned something else about that got me thinking about what's known as intelligibility. So I'm sure you're all familiar with the hard solipsism problem.
Yep.
Everybody probably knows whether they even know what that means or not because we've all seen the movie The Matrix. It's a great movie.
Hmm. Yep.
And that kind of alludes to that concept. But the
Yep.
way that we get around hard solipsism, it's not just kind of like what Descartes said, I am there, I think, therefore I am. But that's kind of a very simple way of saying that what other philosophers have come to is intelligibility, and there's 3 tenets to intelligibility, and for some reason I can't remember the third, but the first 2 are basically, one of them is our senses are reliable. So my sense of touch, my sense of sight, all 5 of my senses are in fact reliable because they have to be in order for me to function in the world. Whether I'm just a brain in a vat or not becomes
Yep.
irrelevant because I can't function in life that way. I have to interact with the life or else I don't. I'm not interacting. So in order to actually practically interact with life, my senses have to be somewhat valuable, reliable. And the other proposition is that our memories are somewhat reliable. Now, that doesn't mean we remember everything perfectly, obviously. And Lou, he knows what I'm talking about. The older I get, the less my memory fails me more and more. But as a species, our memories are going to be somewhat reliable. We have to accept that fact. So we can look into history. We can think about our previous experiences. When I say, yeah, I remember that I just ate bacon and eggs for the last 3 breakfasts in a row and my stomach isn't feeling that great. Maybe I should have some vegetables or some fruit in my cereal or some more fiber or something like that because I remember accurately what decisions I made, what actions I made or performed that got me to where I'm at right now. And if we don't have intelligibility, then we have no way to function in the real world.
Hmm.
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 Now,
Yep.
I got to ask you, Objective, because I think I'll understand where you're coming from with that. But when you're talking about that, it makes me realize just how horrendous it is when people have advanced dementia. Because my mom passed away and had advanced dementia.
Hmm.
And when you were talking about that, it brings to mind how just horrible that is
That's
because the
such
memory is gone.
Mm.
it's such a tragic thing for people to have to go through. I've obviously never personally experienced it. I have had some experiences with friends and family, and it is, in particular, I have a friend who's a friend of my wife's, really, but she's a wonderful human being, and her mother, who I do know personally, she ended up suffering from really bad dementia. And my heart goes out to not only that individual, but the family members who go to visit and they don't even, their own mother doesn't even know who they are. And up on the flip side of that, these people that experience this dementia, oftentimes they're the most loving people. They've done so much good for others in their lives. They've been so involved, so self-sacrificing to other people. And then they, you know, time comes and they don't even know who anybody is, and they still have all this goodness, if I could use that word, all these wonderful traits as a human being, but don't have any memories, which is a real interesting look into where these things come from. Our kindness, where does it come from? If we don't have any memory, any functional memory, but we still are kind and loving and peaceful, obviously there's some that comes from somewhere within us. You know, it makes it for an interesting conversation. I certainly don't have any answers to that though, but I agree with you, the tragedy, absolute tragedy of it.
Yeah, it's an awful condition, and it dehumanizes a person just by what you were saying. You know, it really dehumanizes an individual, that disease.
You know,
But I think
one of
this
the
actually points. Oh, I'm sorry, Scott. Can I just real
oh
quick?
yeah, go right ahead. Yes, sir.
Lou, I think what this does do is when we think about dementia is a perfect example. And another thing I would think of is, let's say a person is born with a mental disorder where like they have like a social disorder, they call it, you know, antisocial personality disorder, or one of these other things that lead people to commit terrible crimes, just not just murder, but the most horrific types of murder and stuff, is they get into real psychological problems here that we have diagnosed people with. Does that remove them from a moral responsibility, from culpability for their actions? And I would say no, based on the fact that it's not so much whether it removes them from culpability per se. I still don't think it does. But at the same point in time, how do we punish these people compared to how we would punish somebody who has a full capacity? But what it does do, in my opinion, is it does give credence to the idea that there is still this objective morality if we're tying it to nature. Because even though people are not cognitive, don't have their full mental capacities or a full understanding, it doesn't absolve the actions from being moral or immoral. It might limit certain amounts of culpability, but it does not mean, it's just like, think of it, a small child. If a small child takes a gun and X's their parents because a loaded gun was laying around the house, that certainly doesn't mean, just because they're a small child that didn't know any better, that that's not terribly immoral. Because if we're just leaving loaded weapons around everybody's house, society would not last very long, right? So we could look at this as more evidence for objective ethics, in my opinion.
Yeah,
Can
now
I ask you a question, objective?
Of course,
and,
anything.
and of course, this is not it's just off the cuff. I see society today, America anyway, as having a lot of loaded guns sitting around houses, right? So would you think that's not a good idea? Because I don't think it's a good idea to have a bunch of
So
loaded.
I actually have a very interesting, so my father was actually murdered when I was younger. He was shot in his sleep. And so I have a real personal attachment to this. So it might surprise a lot of people when I say I do not have a problem with guns per se. As far as I'm concerned, at this point where we're at in society right now, people need to be able to defend themselves. Now, I've been heavily involved in the martial arts for a very long time, and I'm not trying to tough guy everybody and whatever. I'm just saying it like it is. So I don't have a fear that if somebody breaks into my house, that I cannot even disarm them if they come in with a weapon. If I get up out of bed, I have a really good confidence that I can deal with that situation with just my bare hands. That doesn't mean it's true, but I have this training. I think it's important for every single human being to have a certain level of training, because we live in the real world. And if we do not, we have to regulate crime. We have to stop criminals, whether that means I stop them myself or I ask a police officer who's going to have a gun to come stop the bad guys. We have to stop bad people from doing bad things.
yeah, I
Yeah, I
agree to
mean,
that. I agree
I
to that.
agree with that too. And the thing is, I'm wondering, like, does any of this affect your view on gun control? Not
Well,
not The fact
I
that, of
do think
course, people have to. There are people I agree should have guns. Right?
Right.
It's not like I'm not an extremist, so to say, but I do think in America we have too many loaded guns sitting in houses.
Well, I would say two things. First of all, just to be clear with everybody, if I could snap my fingers and get rid of every single gun and every single nuclear bomb and every single thing of this nature and just instantly poof it out of existence with the old Thanos snap, I would do it in a heartbeat. I would do it absolutely in a heartbeat. I think if we took it away across the board from everybody, that would be great. However, because that's not realistic, there are bad people that have access to these things. We need to make sure good people have access to
Hmm.
these things as well. That's I want to make sure I'm clear about that. So
Yeah.
yeah, I would say that if I could just snap my fingers, I would do away with all of it. You know what I mean? I would be like that 1970s song. Let's get rid of all the bombs and the guns and the wars, right? but
And do you eat meat? Do you eat animals, like
so
animal
I
meat, stuff like that?
I actually do. I went through a real phase in my life where I was really focused on nonviolence. And to me, I took it to the full extreme when I wasn't eating any kind of meat or anything like that. And the reason that I eat meat now is two reasons. One, my doctor said that I had become almost anemic almost overnight. Now, I have a very fast metabolism, so I am
Hmm.
able to keep myself in really good shape pretty easily. I like to exercise and stuff. But if I don't eat enough heavy proteins, I will have a problem with anemia because of how fast my metabolism is. The other issue is that when you look at nature, right, the way that we have evolved as a species, we have carnivores, we have omnivores, and we have herbivores. And this is a fact in life. So it's not so much that eating meat is wrong, it's how do we treat the animals that we're going to eat because we are highly evolved. Are we going to drag them down in the Sahara Desert and bite their necks and suffocate them? Are we going to attack them like a pack of wild dogs and nip at their heels until they fall down from exhaustion and then eat them alive? Or are we going to raise them up in a safe environment where they don't have to worry about predators? They don't have to worry about looking for food. And when they've lived a full life, we're going to put a bullet in the back of their head and mercifully end things and then eat them. I don't see that as being inhumane personally. So it's how are we approaching this situation? The other thing I would say is that back to my non-meat eating phase, even the plants eat something. They
Yep.
they take nutrients out of the soil against the soil's will, if there was such a thing. So it starts at the very bottom of the food chain. Single-celled organisms that became multicellular organisms had to eat something in order to replicate and duplicate. We wouldn't be here if this wasn't a natural process in life. So where are we going to draw the line? You know what I mean? At that point, I don't.
Yeah.
That so to me, it's about the
Insecticides,
behavior.
if you're a vegan, you want to eat vegetables, but to grow these vegetables, you have to use insecticides to kill, insects that can destroy the crops. And then even, it's questionable whether plants have some form of awareness. Do they feel pain? We don't know. Not really,
No,
fundamentally.
I think that's a beautiful point, and I actually have been meditating on that, and I don't have any answers. But when you talk about consciousness, this is something I didn't want to throw a wrench into things. But since you mentioned this plant thing, I think it applies. Where are we drawing the line on consciousness? Because
Right.
there are animals that interact with their environment, like a jellyfish, for example, that doesn't even have a brain. It has a very simple nervous system, but there's no brain even attached to it. But it responds to their environment. It collects food. It reproduces. So, what is consciousness, and where are we going to draw the line with that? You know,
Right. So that gets into the hard problem of consciousness.
right?
Um,
Mhm.
people say, well, it just emerges from matter, dead, unthinking matter. If you just combine enough of it in just the right way, then this thing called an experience will just magically pop out like a genie from a bottle, right? That's the story. That's the hand wave. Not very satisfying. And even when you get up into consciousness, you wonder, why is there a correlation? Why is there a conscious experience at all that correlates to any sort of brain state or any sort of neural firing? At what point does it kick in, so to speak? So you've got the demarcation problem. You've got the combination problem. Why is just combining a bunch of stuff together mean voila, we have consciousness? would we apply that same logic in any other area of exploration? We don't seem to. You wouldn't think that if I just put enough water pipes together on the earth, it'll become conscious. What's the principle? What's the theory behind that? There is no theory for it. It's just, we just take it as a brute fact. And so, you could say panpsychism makes consciousness fundamental along with matter. But the only issue with that, it's got its own problem, the combination problem. Why is combining one little conscious entity with another one, why does it eventually turn into this unified conscious being we call like a human, or something else? That's the combination problem. And so I sort of lean towards idealism to fix the hard problem, because it makes consciousness fundamental and matter as an appearance within consciousness. And so it's kind of unintuitive, but it's more parsimonious, because think about it. Whenever you devise a model or a theory of anything, you try to make it as parsimonious as possible. Occam's razor. You don't want to include a lot of unknowns, like, with theism, you're inviting a whole new category of things to explain another mystery. But, consciousness is the fundamental thing we all experience. That's the only thing we have. This outside world is an assumption. It's an abstraction. So all of this stuff exists and resides within mind. The issue is all of our minds are, kind of disassociated. Lou's got his own thoughts. I've got my own objective. You've got your own thoughts. We're all disassociated from each other, right? Well, that's kind of not very surprising, because we see that in nature too. Like, say, with dissociation disorder, identity disorder.
Right,
You can
right.
even our own minds. They say that we're just a collection of different conscious agents. Split brain patient. You can split his colossum, right? And his right brain may be an atheist, and the left side might not be. Yeah, like there's two different personalities, two streams of consciousness going on at the same time. And so,
Hey,
yeah,
I want to ask both of you very intelligent men a question before I go.
sure.
And it's only because I actually made a video that I'm posting tomorrow. Okay. And in the video, my videos, when I make videos, I'm just speaking off the cuff. I don't have them scripted. I just talk. All right. And there's something I mentioned in my video that's coming out tomorrow that I'd like your opinions on. All right. And that is, when we talk about a mind, okay, and then we talk about a brain, right? The question I would have for both of you fellas, because I'm curious of what you would think. Can you have a mind without a brain?
No, I don't think so. And I think this actually ties, Lou, that question is perfect right now, because it really ties into the whole consciousness concept. What I was going to say about that anyway,
Yes.
is that the mind, we need to think of the mind as a property of the brain, just like in physics. Energy is a property of matter, so to speak. It doesn't necessarily exist. Energy doesn't technically exist. Matter exists. Potentiality and static energy, and then you have chemical energy, and you have radiant energy and whatnot. But until you get into matter, none of that actually is applied, right? The mind and the brain has this same type of a connection, where the mind is simply a property of the brain. If you take away the brain, the mind has no matter with which to interact with. Therefore, whether or not so therefore a mind cannot, quote unquote, exist. Does that make sense if I put it
Yeah,
succinctly as
Hmm.
that's
possible?
kind of how I see it. But I was curious what both of you fellas thought, because one thing that I've been hearing, and it's literally makes me personally kind of giggle a little bit, and that is that God is the mind that has no brain.
Yeah.
And to me, that just doesn't make sense. I don't know, but
So, like, from my point of view, right? I would say that I kind of agree with what Objective's saying, that the brain is sort of like a proper, or the mind is a property of the brain. They're definitely correlated, and so the way that I form my worldview is that, as far as I can ever know, the only thing I can really know, for example, for sure, is how things appear to me in my experience. And so the brain, I would say, is what consciousness of another person looks like from a third person disassociative boundary. So by looking at another person's brain, or looking at my brain through a fMRI or whatever, I'm looking at what my conscious states or brain states look like from a disassociated point of view, because the conscious experience is definitely disassociated from the things that you're looking at. We have no direct access to those things. Those things just appear in mind. So I would say, depending on your perspective, on one perspective, yeah, you've got to have a human brain, to have a human form of consciousness from that perspective, from that disassociated perspective.
Or an animal
Ultimately,
brain.
you're an animal brain or whatever it
Yeah.
is.
I don't
Even
really think it
even
has to
some
be human.
Yeah, and
You
some
know.
some organisms are considered intelligent and conscious, and they don't have a brain at all, or even a nervous system, like, say, a paramecium, or say a slime mold. These things are very rational. They're aware of their position in time and space, and they make decisions, and they don't do everything the same way, like a pre-programmed sort of LI or something like that. They actually think on the fly, so they're considered conscious. We debate whether plants are conscious, and they don't have brains or whatever. So I think that it's easy to be sort of a chauvinist, like a biologic or a brain chauvinist. Like, we think that only we humans can have consciousness because we have this almighty brain. But really, there's another aspect that people talk about, that talks about, really, consciousness is a pattern. It's a pattern. So
Yeah,
if you
but when
follow
we
the
say,
pattern,
see what I'm asking is, God is supposed to be spirit,
yeah.
right? God is not physical. So God doesn't have arms, right?
Well,
He doesn't
if
he
you
doesn't
well,
have a brain.
which God are you talking about, though? You're talking
Well,
about
the
the
Christian
Christian.
God,
Okay, well, the
you
Christian
know.
God, he does have feet and arms, and
Uh,
you
no,
know,
but there's when you talk to a Christian, they'll say, God is spirit.
yeah,
He doesn't have arms or legs.
true,
Although you
true.
can find verses in the Bible that would say that he has certain things, right?
Yeah, I guess
But
I was thinking about Old Testament.
yeah,
Yeah, you're
but
right,
but
because that's when that
realistically,
changed. Yeah.
when engaging with Christian people, they don't see God as having arms, legs, faces, or brains,
Hmm.
right? Because the brain is a physical thing. But they do think God is a mind.
It's
Hmm.
And
because what
I
you get into with
don't think
Christian
that really
epistemology,
makes sense.
no, it doesn't. But what you get into with the Christian epistemology is two problems that they don't realize. That one of them is cognitive dissonance, and the other one is called special pleading. Okay, so just like I mentioned before with the young brother, I was questioning him. So if God has a mind, how is God subject? How is God supposed to be subject or objective at that point, right? And he couldn't answer. And
Right.
I appreciate his honesty, but
Yeah.
I kind of put him on the hot seat there. And the same thing applies here. You could say with anything, like your talk right now is about morality, right? We say that murdering, Xing babies by way of drowning them is always immoral. There's no exceptions across the world and throughout history. There's no exceptions, and Christians will agree with you right up until the point to where you start talking about Noah's flood myth, and then all of a sudden God is no longer attached to morality. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
Because it becomes a cognitive dissonance,
Yeah.
which is where you say two things that are opposite are both true, which is a logical breaks one of the laws of logic. This is where cognitive dissonance comes in. The other thing that you have is what's called special pleading, where it's true all times until I find a reason why I don't want it to be true anymore, and I'm going to special plead that one out of the equation.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
you both seem to agree with me. And like I said, I speak off the cuff, but pretty much common sense, even going with just common sense of, what we know to be true, without getting even deep. If you don't have a brain, if something has no brain, they're not capable of thought, so they don't have a mind, is what my theory is.
Well, here, I would tend to agree with you. Like, I don't have a problem with that. Like, it wouldn't cause a problem for my worldview. The only thing that causes me a problem with that is, unfortunately, I know about situations like facts that are in the world of people that exist with like 95% of their or 98% of their brain missing, that function like pretty normal. And I'm wondering, how do they do that? And so I guess as far as I would say it is, I'd say that it seems like consciousness for me is always identified with some sort of living system. As long as it's alive and it's embodied, I would assume that it's conscious like me because I'm alive and I'm a physical body. So,
Yes, but
I
you're a physical body. I'm a physical body, but God is not a physical body,
right,
right?
right, right, right.
So we go into this weird, like I consider it strange. You go into this world of, you know, what is God, and then it's like, well, God is spirit. He's the mind. He's the all powerful mind. I hear that a lot, but yet God doesn't have a brain. He doesn't have the organ we call a brain. And
Well,
and that just to me gets really strange. And I don't relate to a being who has no brain and has no substance that is in any way, shape, or
grounding it.
form
You're looking for
real.
grounding. You're looking for
Like I don't think that
tangible.
is being real.
Right,
You know?
right. And and a lot of that, what's hanging you up, you got to understand, is your assumptions going in, your presuppositions, so to speak. Because it sounds like what you are is probably roughly a physicalist. You see that,
Yeah.
physical things are real, and these
Yes.
invisible things are more like imaginary concepts, things that are not real, things that are mainly just made up stories or concepts, and those things have no value. Like, you hit your knee on a chair, well, you're going to know that's real as opposed to some imaginary thing that you can imagine
Yeah.
maybe striking you and it doesn't really hurt. But,
Yeah.
so you're sort of putting, if you really dig deep into it, everything we experience happens within us. Even the pains, the way things appear, the physicality, all of this stuff are abstractions at the end of the day. Let's say you reduce it. Let's say you're a scientist, Lou, and you go and reduce what you see. Like, say that picture behind you, you get a super electron microscope. You start looking down and you get to a certain point. Well, guess what? You're going to get to the Planck scale, and then there's going to be nothing to measure because it doesn't make sense anymore. There's no things at that point of reality. So there comes a point when physicality reduces down to just a probability distribution. That's what they call it in physics and science, is a probability. A probability isn't a physical material thing. A probability is sort of an abstraction. It's a number. It's a set of numbers. And but these things sort of have effects in the real world. In fact, quantum mechanics is one of the most successful theories in science. So you take these things serious, yet they're not material things. They're abstractions, things out of our mind, things that we just imagine. You know what I mean? And so material,
Abstractions. I
yeah.
look
So
at God as an abstraction. That's how I see
yes,
it. All right.
of course,
So I will tell someone, you know, if you feel that God is abstract, I'm not going to argue that point because
yeah,
I think God is abstract,
of
right?
course, of course.
But the question that comes to me next is an abstraction real? And I say no. And the guest I had on that one day, he was a Christian and he agreed with that,
Hmm.
right? Which was very unusual to me. He was very different. All
Well,
right. Because
yeah, yeah.
he said that God isn't real. You
Right.
know, he actually said that.
Well, the
Yeah,
thing I
because
think we need to focus on, though, is kind of what I was saying before, is that when you have a property of something, it needs to act on something in order to make it quote unquote real. The thing that it's acting on can be observed, and that's real. But in order for a property to be useful to us and to explain how a property affects matter, we have to do this through the interaction of property, energy, for
bingo.
example, as a property. So it's not to say that a property isn't ostensibly real, quote unquote, because, for example, you talked about the pain receptors, right? The pain, there's people who will lose a limb in war, and they experience what's called phantom pain. So they'll get an itching or a burning sensation in an arm they don't even have anymore,
Yep.
because it's interacting with a different property they have, which is the brain is still there. And so the brain is telling them there's an itch or a burning sensation. So without some type of property, or I'm sorry, some type of matter, forgive me, then that property doesn't have anything to interact with. So when we get down to what the gentleman was talking about, the Planck scale, which is an excellent example, the problem is that we have to have a way to apply things practically at the end of the day in order for us to function in life. So we have to give a certain amount of credence that we now call probability, right, through mathematics and other avenues, so where we can apply something practically to the world we're actually living in. Now, if we want
Bingo.
to come down to what was before the Big Bang, for example, right? What happened before the Planck scale or Planck time? We're never going to find that out. This is why I'm an agnostic. I will never say there's no such thing as a God. I'll never say there is a God. I don't think we can make any definitive claims about something that's unfalsifiable. And ultimately, what we're talking about with the analogy of the picture is you're going to get to a point to where you break physics, essentially, and
Yep.
we just don't have the language to try and go any further than that. So what
Well,
we have
even
to
in
do is say, okay,
principle, if it's if you shine enough light, and along with gravity, the way gravity works and the way light works, if you get to 10 to the minus 33 centimeters, right, at the Planck scale, you get to that level, that's when you create a black hole. With enough, energy and gravity, it's just going to create a black hole, and then you're going to lose all the information that you obtained because you've sucked your whole laboratory into a black hole. So that's the principle that's at play here: is that it's just impossible to access reality at a certain point. And even physicists are mesmerized because they say 10 to the minus 33 centimeters isn't even that big of a number, relatively speaking. If it was like 10 to the minus, 5 trillion, then, they say we'd be kind of impressed. But this is really sort of janky, of a reality that we're able to explore. It's not really that broad. And so, we just get to that point where, our axioms, all our theories break down. Every model, every theory is only as good as the constraints that you can define. You know, that's how science works. We work within frameworks, but at a certain point, you have an axiom, and even if you were to solve the axiom, now you've got to solve those problems, and it goes on infinitum. And so it's just kind of inaccessible to get to a certain point of reality to know anything for certain. So I'm like you, objective. I try to keep it humble and understand these things and say that there may be a God, there may be something. But one thing I do agree too with you is you talked about this property has to act it's on something, and this kind of just reminds me of my view of like the Platonic forms and things of that nature. Some kind of pattern can, sort of maybe, we talk about the quantum field, excitations in the quantum field, this probability distribution. That's where these patterns come from. And these patterns evolve into what we call brains and humans and the whole world around us. And so maybe that's where we can sort of ground stuff as an information, like integrated information theory. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
yeah, and another, excuse me, another thing I wanted to just mention there real quick is that it's interesting, and I know Lou's trying to get out of here. I don't want to be rude,
Yep. Yeah.
but
Yeah.
there's physicists, from my understanding, when you mentioned the information, losing the information in the black hole, uh, from what I understand, and I'm not a physicist, I'm a boat manufacturer, if anything, that, so that's really, this is kind of getting outside of my field here to a certain degree. But from what I understand, physicists are saying is that the information itself is actually never lost. It's just like anything, it cannot be
Mm-hmm.
destroyed once it's created. What we
It's on the
lose is our
horizon.
access.
Yeah.
Yeah, we lose our access to the information, but the
Yeah.
information itself it is infinite. It goes on infinitely, like you were saying.
That's perfect, man. I love that. That's so wild because they said it actually gets embedded on a two-dimensional sort of what do they call it? It's a horizon, event horizon around the black hole. And that's
Right,
where all the information, when the black hole sucked in the star or whatever it is, it lost all that mass. And that's turned into information states. And that
right, right,
information is plastered around the black hole in the form of a two-dimensional sheet. And so even people say that we're sort of a hologram that projects itself from that two sheet, because you could apply that to the whole universe. In fact, our whole universe may be existing outside of or inside of a black hole.
right.
You know what I'm saying? And so our conscious experience may just be a projection from that deeper level of reality, like that, that level. So, I mean, all of this stuff sounds really weird, and it sounds very like, how do they even know this stuff? But it's just amazing what these people can find out just by using math.
Anyway, guys, I appreciate you coming on. All
Yeah.
right.
Thank you so much.
For the record, and between us, I don't see how you could have a mind without a brain. That's me.
Yeah. Yep.
All right, and appreciate you coming on. I really appreciate the insights and the intelligence. It's far beyond me. All right, but I like to engage with it, and I like to have these discussions. I learn too. I learn a lot. So I
Me too,
appreciate
man.
both of you guys.
Thank you so
Well,
much, Lou,
that's
for
very
having
kind
me.
of you, Lou. You're very humble, and I think you are also a very intelligent human being. And I think that you're also, as I've mentioned before, you're in touch with humanistic side. You're very kind. You're very considerate, and then, so I think that you definitely don't sell yourself short there, because we're just a couple. I'll speak for myself. I'm just an idiot who has certain things that I've learned. But the more I learn, like we said before, the more I realize how much I don't know, and I'm learning from you gentlemen. I learned from the Christian who was in here. I learned from people who are in the chat. So it's an
Yeah.
opportunity for me to continue to grow, but it's a never ending journey. Once we think we've gotten there, we're fooling ourselves.
That's one of my pet peeves about religion. That's one of my pet peeves is that I find a lot of religious people feel they have arrived. They have it. Whereas for me, I'm always learning something. And if I'm shown to be wrong, I'm willing to say, I was wrong about that.
Praise
You
science.
know.
All right, I'll
Anyway,
get out of here. Scott, it was so nice to meet you. If you ever want to hook up sometime, you reach out to
Yes.
me anytime, brother. We
Please,
have a lot
please,
we could talk about.
please, Lou, can you send me his email? I'd love to have you on my show to discuss, because it sounds like we're like on the same page, bro.
Yeah, do you have a
exactly.
channel? No, I
Yeah.
don't think you have my email.
Yeah, I don't.
Scott has a channel.
Yeah, the discussion, and what I'll do is, if we exchange emails or whatever, I can send you, we can maybe coordinate and get a nice little talk together.
Is your email on your channel description?
Yes,
Perfect. I will go ahead and look for you then, and I'll reach out to you.
absolutely, man. Thank you so much, brother.
All
All
right, you
right,
guys have a
thank
good
you.
night.
Yep, you too. Thank you.
Bye.